Greetings, rabble rousers. My name is Jessa McLean. Welcome to Blueprints for Disruption, a weekly discussion dedicated to amplifying activism across Turtle Island. Together, we will examine tactics, explore motivations, and celebrate successes in disrupting the status quo. This podcast is a proud part of New Left Media. So we've got another special edition of Blueprints up, one where we are going to break down and reveal just how Canada's leftist party, the NDP, operate. We're going to examine its power structure and its internal democracy, if we can call it that. Now, I don't want you to always have to just take my word for what goes on in the NDP. The last episode, Candidate Crisis, we took many stories that were public knowledge and compiled them to explain that part of the process and why that is such a detriment to democracy and to the left. And this time, we've got three great guests on, and they're going to share firsthand experience from inside the party. All of our guests today were elected by the membership, by NDP membership, to be a part of the party executive. We'll have two members on from the Ontario NDP, and we'll have a member of the federal executive join us as well. Jay, we've heard from him before. Now, the executive is supposed to play a key role in the new Democratic Party. But what we find out, though, is that it is largely inaccessible, it lacks transparency, and seems to serve essentially as a rubber stamp for the choices that have already been made by senior staff. This, again, what we're trying to point out is just how small a group actually control the only leftist party within Canada, and what that is doing to the people that join the party and what that translates into policy. And it's not pretty. It wasn't easy finding people to come forward either. The folks that have are incredibly brave because, as we've demonstrated, the party is very vindictive to those who condemn it publicly. And when you couple that with the historic fact that so few who get onto the party executive seem to do so with any intention of instituting any kind of reforms, many, like Akuah explains, seem to be apathetic and resigned to the fact it is the way it is. We'll get into internal elections and why that is in another episode entirely, but it does play into this, certainly. So let's first hear from Akuah Frempong. This is one amazing human being that I have been lucky to be put in contact with my work in New Demochat. Her perspective is one of someone who has just joined the Ontario NDP executive and what it's been like navigating that space. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Akuah. Can you introduce yourself to listeners before we start?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Akuah Frempong, pronoun she, her, and I'm one of the Central East co-chairs on the Ontario NDP Executive. I reside in Whitby, where I am the communications director for my local EDA. And I'm currently running for school board trustee in my area on top of all of that. So a lot of organizing that I've grown to love and really appreciate in terms of getting out there and meeting community members. And through the NDP, I've had the amazing opportunity to meet wonderful organizers and activists such as yourself. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Akuah. I learn something every time I talk to you, and I'm interested to get the inside scoop from the Ontario NDP executive. But first, I'd like to, a lot of folks don't plug in this deep into electoral politics. They may join a campaign around election time. They may even sit on their riding association. Akuah referred to it as an EDA. What made you go that much further because that is an elected position that you hold within the Ontario NDP. What made you run for that position?
So I'll be very honest, it wasn't very planned. I didn't really know much about the structure of what was going to happen at convention that took place in February. It was my first time attending a convention, whether provincially or federally, and I only started organizing with the party formally by joining my EDA just last summer. So it's all my involvement, I would say, is fairly recent. So I think just through my EDA and some the two last federal elections that I volunteered for, I guess I started to get the ear of my organizer. So the day that we were scheduled to have those elections, like randomly in the afternoon, I was like at work and I got a call from my organizer saying, "Hey, would you consider like running for Central East Co-Chair?" And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." To be honest, I wasn't planning on it. Like I was just gonna pay my fees, sit on Zoom for the 3 days, and kind of just learn about the inner workings of the party because I haven't really been preview to it. I don't really know the internal structure of what goes on, but through Helen, who's one of the persons living with disabilities co-chairs, absolutely phenomenal. They do such incredible work. We actually sit on our local EDA together. So they announced that they were going to be running formally, and I was like, we absolutely support you. They had a whole bunch of resolutions that they put forward that our local EDA sponsored, and it was really nice to hear, and it's also disheartening, which we'll get to in a bit, in terms of their experience and how they wanted to be more involved in shape policy, just in terms of combating a lot of the ableism that's taken place in our party. And I was like, I'd absolutely want to help and support you in that. And this gave me an opportunity to do that further and kind of find out what was happening in the party and why there were so many issues that I felt like people weren't really getting answers to. And then through that, I was able to build community through New Demo Chat, and then everything kind of just came together. So literally in the afternoon, I was like, yeah, I guess I'll think about it. And then I did a nomination through the floor, had a speech prepared, and it was everything came forward from there. It was actually kind of awkward because during that break, I think it was on the Saturday when they announced it, I literally like rushed out to get groceries with my mom, and then I came back and they're like, "Hey, Akuah, you won," and I was like, "Okay, cool, thanks." So that was kind of funny, but yeah, it was an interesting 3 days, and wanting to, honestly, might sound cliche, but wanting to support the disability committee more, I think, was a lot of my driving force, and really find out about the inner workings of the party, because just everything that Helen was going through in those meetings just didn't make any sense to me, and it didn't seem like anyone was doing anything about it. And then I remember you also sat in on that committee on the Friday, and it was just it was just terrible. Like I've never sat through a committee meeting like that for that hour, and I was like, yeah, we there's work to do. So
clearly, yeah. And I hear you say, like, I didn't know how the processes work, and I don't think that's because you're new. You pick up things quite quickly. It's not communicated well. I think most people went into that convention not really understanding how it works. So it's quite brave to step forward. I think, especially being so new and sensing that there was a lot of work to do. So kudos to you for kind of stepping up to do that. And I know my face lit up when you nominated yourself, or when you were nominated from the floor. That was a relief, that, there would be a friendly face, because I too am part of Central East. So I'm thankful for you to be one of our representatives. Now, you knew there were issues that needed fixing, and you mentioned wanting to help out the disability committee. How else did you envision your participation? Were you confident that you could make a difference?
honestly, I was, and I think that's just from like, this might be self-absorbed, but I think just from like my like personality and how I organize and how I connect with people. Like I thought that would be something good to bring to the table in terms of bringing forth a different perspective of how I felt that policies and procedures should be, how we should be connecting with our membership. I know in Whitby, or I guess I would say Durham, we're a little bit more isolated because we're technically considered the 905, but like I mean, nobody really knows, or like the NDP isn't strong here. Like of our 5 ridings, we have one elected representative in Oshawa, Jennifer French, who just recently, thank goodness, was reelected. So we're essentially back to where we started. So there isn't really a lot of like love for Durham as opposed to our Toronto Central ridings that like very much seem to be the center point and focus for the entire party, which doesn't really make sense to me given how many ridings are outside of that demographic. So I thought it would be a really good way to kind of connect as well within our um, within our region. Like I'm very strong. I really believe in the Durham region riding, and we have a lot of population growth. The tides are turning, so to speak. I think we're going to see that with our upcoming municipal election, and there's an itch for organizing here, but again, it's a lot of a conservative and liberal stronghold, and I feel like we really haven't had an opportunity to kind of like break wind a bit, but it's just like we're not getting the organizing here that I would like, and I thought that perhaps having someone like myself come forward could maybe help bridge that gap a bit. But it's been interesting to say the least. Sorry if my voice sounds a little bit weird. My best friend got married over the weekend, and I sang every single song under the sun until 1 a.m. So this is what I
And
sound
so you
like.
should,
But
and so you should have. So then, how's it going? I mean, I've seen some of the work that you've been doing and some of the advocating that you have been doing, and I do think that you have made impact. Are you satisfied with the impact, or tell us a little bit of what your experience has been like in the months that you have sat on the executive for the Ontario NDP?
so I'll be very honest, and I think I've expressed this to you both publicly and privately that I very much seem like I am like talking at people in those meetings, and I don't really feel like how I'm coming across seems to others as being collaborative versus like argumentative. And um up until recently, like I had an emotional moment where I was like, this is not how that should be. Like feeling like I'm carrying that angry black woman trope is like very, it's a lot. Like it's a lot to deal with. Like I've already had to deal with it in my personal life just because of how I present. Like I consider myself to be very strong-willed and outspoken, and I don't know if it's the tone of my voice. I don't know if it's how I'm saying things. I don't know if it's because I'm frustrated because I feel like nobody else is really speaking about those things, but I just feel like how I'm coming across is very combative, and therefore like I'm not able to really be as effective and like get things done or frankly get clarification on the things that I'm asking about, which is quite frustrating. Because I know what I'm saying makes sense, and even if it's not coming out that way, like there's ways that um other exec members perhaps can explain it in a way that I'm not. We had a meeting over the weekend, and one of the exec members was like, "Hey, I've been here for some time. If you want to reach out, and I'd be happy to explain processes to you." And I'm like, "That's great, and it's great that they did that." But my issue is not necessarily with the processes, while they absolutely are an issue, and I think um, the disabled committee has very much like brought that to the forefront recently, with some emails and some correspondence and things that have been going and petitions that have been going around. But my big thing is, which I don't feel like I have as much clarification on, is also who is involved in these processes and how did these individuals get involved in these processes, and how do we get more provincial council delegates involved in these processes. And that's kind of what my big thing is. And I don't know if the party is technically an organization and relatively runs as a business. Again, I don't know. I'm just thinking about it in like the organization that I work for in healthcare, where I go to the website and I can see who our team is and how to contact them. Um, Mind you, I understand if there's like internal committees, you maybe don't want that information put on the website or things like that. But I know that the communication piece in terms of how people contact executive members has been an issue. So actually, fun fact, if you do want to contact the executive, it's through executive@ontariondp.ca. And then if you're
Who
asking to
answers
speak,
that email?
pardon?
Who receives that email?
So from my understanding, I'm just going to say, I'm under the impression it's someone in internal staff. And then let's say if you wanted to get in contact with me and didn't know how to, and you wrote to that executive email and was like, I want to speak to Akuah specifically, then the staff member who's answering that email would then contact me internally and say, hey, do you want to speak further to this, or do you consent to having your like personal email shared with this individual? And then that's how we would connect. I
That's
guess the
pretty
main way
selective
that,
gatekeeping.
sorry.
Sorry, Akuah. It was a comment that like it's pretty selective gatekeeping then, right? Like
That's what it seemed like to me. When I asked initially at our first executive meeting if we could just have the list made public, there was, from my understanding, it was an issue with potential spam that could be overloaded, which I mean, I understand that, and the fact that not all of us have consented to having our email shared publicly. So I was told that, for instance, because I'm a regional chair, or if you're an equity group seeking chair, you would share your emails during like those meetings. And then I guess if people outside of that wanted to contact you further, they could go through the executive email. So that, from when I asked the question just this past weekend, that seems to be the process to go forward. I don't think that that's going to change. If people want to just have their email readily available, that's fine. What I think would even be better is if we just had, like, for instance, like the Persons Living with Disabilities Committee, like if you're an equity seeking group, you would have like that particular email function. So like, I think it's like Women's Committee at OntarioNDP.ca, or like those ones. So then if we already have those for the equity seeking groups, and I'm of the assumption that only the chairs of those committees have access to those particular email handles, then why don't we just do the same for all the other positions? So either you create an at OntarioNDP.ca email for every executive member that is public, or you have it a little bit more, maybe not name specific, and then you just have like Central East co-chair or whatever at OntarioNDP.ca, and then therefore myself and Dave, my counterpart, would then be the only people answering that email if they had specific questions for us. Like, if the issue is we don't want to receive spam, then instead of us receiving that spam through our personal emails, like, why can't it just be an OntarioNDP.ca email address that's like relatively like central party regulated with all of their, I guess IT and antivirus or whatever, and then just have the people who are elected to those positions take hold of those email addresses throughout their term. Like, I don't think that there's an issue with that. And then if anything, if you want to archive emails or delete emails or whatever, just have a clean slate for the next people who come into that position, then they just take on that email address.
Yeah, I think like if it had been a one-off, or, we weren't this far into the technology game where creating emails for people to access wasn't just so commonplace, we could think that it was a mistake. But I think like you can see, and other people have testified, and we'll hear throughout this episode, is there's always kind of this focus on control versus access. And we're the NDP, right? We have Democratic in our name, and we may be structured like a company, which, we're talking about here, and I think is part of the problem. But as an elected representative, I should be able to get in touch with you, not through you shouldn't be able to decide whether or not you can hear from me. Do you know what I mean? Like, our MPs and MPPs don't get to decide whether we are able to communicate with them or their office directly. So it's definitely limiting access to members, because we've seen recently, and Jay will testify, that any attempts to contact the executive more directly, because often there's issues with staff, and so staff intercepting these emails from the onset are are a privacy problem for the members that are trying to reach their representatives directly. And with the amount of trust that exists right now in the NDP, how do we know those emails are actually getting through to the folks to even make that choice? Not to mention whatever's in that email has then been revealed to a staffer, an unelected staffer.
Yeah.
And
that's kind of like the point I was trying to make, where I was like, okay, well then if we have all these admin committees and there's people like supposedly feeling this like work, like who are they? Like, I don't like,
who's behind the curtain, Akuah?
I don't necessarily know or can maybe not even like know or relate to the person who might be intercepting those emails versus if the person just emails me directly. Now, if it's one thing if you just have access to that email, and then it's another thing if the representative decides to respond. But at least you can say that you were able to contact them directly and send them whatever it is that you need to send them, and then whether they respond is up to them. Like, we can give people power and choice to do that. Like, it's not always going to be people flooding those emails with spam, or sometimes they just have a question, or like, the emails that we've received recently from some members of the disabled committee, like they were valid emails where they were trying to contact people and either people weren't responding. So out of desperation, we got one from Lulu, who's also been on your podcast, absolutely fabulous human. And all of the stuff that they've had to go through is just like incredibly disheartening. So thank you for having that episode with them a couple weeks ago. I was just absolutely flabbergasted, and wanted to like hug both of you through like my damn phone when I was listening to it. Because like, yeah, you were crying, they were probably tearing up, and we were absolutely tearing up back here. So thank you for that. But like, for instance, when she sent her email to all of us, like, I was like, did anyone respond to you? And she's like, no one responded to me, but I've been advised that it's been taken to the next step in the anti-harassment. And I'm like, really? Like, I understand that we kind of had this issue where like people were upset that their emails were shared. And I'm like, I get that, but like, no one responded? Really? You read an entire like essay about like harm and things that have been happening in this party, which again is public information. If you go on Lulu's or anyone's Twitter accounts of all the stuff that's been happening, where that incident with one of the MPPs occurred towards the end of last year, like that's public information, right? Like, it's not like this isn't new information that just came forward through this email. So what I'm confused about is, even if we weren't the correct people, to which I responded, and I was like, I honestly, like, I don't know the best way that this is going to be handled, but it's not going to be directly through the executive. And I was then told that her complaint would be an anti-harassment complaint where there's a separate process. And frankly, I have no involvement in that. But really couldn't just be like, no one could respond and say, first of all, like the first thing I said was, thank you for writing this. Like, the emotional labor it took for her to write that email and to put everything in its entirety was a lot for her, like physically and emotionally. And no one wanted to even just write a response and acknowledge that. Like, where's the empathy? Even if we didn't have the best means or tools to solve the problem, which I very much said, Lulu, I'm so sorry. Like, this is not something that is for the exec directly to, like, this is next level. Like, because we also can't be discussing those things throughout our exec meetings. Like, there's a separate process for that, which I then also found out. But I'm like, really? Like, no one wanted to give you any direction or guidance of what you were supposed to do next. And that was what was upsetting to me that I brought up. That was the thing. I was like, it's fine if we say, we don't have the best means to handle this, but respond. A person took time out of their schedule, out of their lives, that for something that's been impacting their lives, that has occurred in this party, that we are responsible for, and no one responded. Like, and that to me was gross.
Total, like, because Lulu doesn't just put emotional labor into that communication.
No.
They have worked on endless amounts of successful campaigns, mobilizing members. But I think, Akuah, she's been unfairly labeled with that same kind of combativeness that you kind talked about at the beginning of this discussion. It maybe not in your nature, but just having to go through these structures. And we've talked about this before on the show, where if you raise a point too many times, if you speak ill will of the party publicly, you essentially become persona non grata within the institution itself. I would imagine any people higher up in the executive are actually cautioned against responding directly to members, because this isn't new to this executive. It was our experience with the previous executive, completely non-responsive. And I think most people, Akuah, and according to our constitution, you keep talking about all these things being handled outside of executive, and that's kind of disconcerting because it should reign supreme. These are the people elected by the members to essentially ensure the party runs well, is aligned with the values that we all signed up for, kind of broadly speaking. Has that been your experience when you sit in these executive meetings? Do you feel like not just you, but you as a group with your comrades there on the executive, are you driving the party in any way?
So I don't know if just because of the timing in which we formed the executive, that this has played out in the way that it has, but we haven't actually had much time to do the actual governance and procedural and policy parts, which I actually enjoy in general. I think I think it's important to understand how a party like that governs in all of these different committees and stuff like that. But because essentially we had our first meeting, was it in March or April? That was our first executive meeting, and a lot of it was procedural stuff, which was fine. And then because the party decided to have convention 4 months prior to an election, everything's just been thrown out of loop. So all of the subsequent meetings that we've technically had have not been full executive meetings. They've been ones regarding this provincial council that's been coming up, and then we had one prior to the election that was election planning, where they were telling us about I guess the leadership tour and finances and all of that. So I think just because of how the positioning we're in right now, and the things that we now have to deal with in the aftermath of needing to get a new leader and reshaping our party, I don't think we're on the actual quote unquote regular trajectory of where the executive would be had it not been had we not come together so quickly. And again, I don't know what has happened previously. Everybody else seems to be very comfortable with the process again, because most of the exec is incumbents. But I kind of would like to hear more from people who aren't incumbents about how they're navigating this space, and maybe that's why the executive member who is not an incumbent, who is an incumbent, reached out to be hey, if you need any assistance or whatever, let me know. But I kind of want to hear more from people who aren't familiar with the process, and I want them to come forward and say, you know what, this is confusing to me, because I'm very quick to say that I don't understand something. And I feel in my meetings that's been that. Our first executive meeting, I think, was 4 hours, and I probably asked a question every 10 minutes, because again, I need that. I need that to, and I think we can also really chalk that up to an accessibility issue, right? Yes, you provided all these documents, but the documents have not been explained. And I know we were going through the process and I was getting clarification on things, which is fine. But I also don't think that me asking questions should be seen as a combative or disruptive thing. I'm genuinely interested and frankly concerned about some of the things that have happened, and I want more clarification. And I feel if anything, as an executive member, I should be owed to that. Nor would it be any different, or would there be any expectation if a non-executive member of our party came forward to ask for that information. So I think it is also an accessibility issue. I can read every document under the sun, but that doesn't mean I understand that document. And it should be a safe space for me to come forward and say, you know what, you've given us this document with all of these things. Here's the process or whatever, but I still don't understand that. Or how can we change this process so that it makes more sense, or it allows involvement for some of our for more of the provincial council executive, because it seems like to me, and Jay made a really good point of this, that it seems very top down instead of bottom up. And I was like, yeah, I can see that, because my understanding is like, let's say if so for instance, like one of the big things was like this past like leadership, the interim leader, where like I guess the caucus had come up with Peter, and then it came to us, and then we were supposed to like support that or approve that nomination or whatever the fine wording was, and then we went to the provincial council, who also like approved the nomination, versus I guess the opportunity for people to have had nominations from the floor, maybe first, and then, I don't know how that would have worked in terms of caucus suggesting someone amongst themselves and then provincial council picking someone amongst themselves. But I don't know. I feel like we should somewhat remain neutral on a lot of things, and maybe allow for more information sharing and suggestions, as opposed to like, this is what it is, like, essentially, do you agree, versus like allowing provincial council, I think, more of an opportunity to not only come up with these processes and procedures, but then also suggest how the processes and procedures should take place, to allow, I think, for more of a democratic process. So
we see this pattern of things being presented already structured to the executive, written by unknown peoples, right? Presumably staffers. It's presented to the executive first. And, you talk about kind of challenges of getting to the bottom of some of these documents, fully understanding them to make an informed decision, share with the people that you represent so that they can make informed decisions when council meets. And, earlier in the episode, I know you didn't hear it, Akuah, but Tara King comes on. She sat in a regional chair position like you on the executive not that long ago. And for over a year. And it became clear, we heard that it is a top-down approach. It doesn't just appear to be. All of these, any attempts to change the processes that have been presented are very difficult. And I just want to hit on a few things before we go for sure. At first, when you say, someone pulled you aside a little bit and said, like, if you need help understanding some of these processes, happy to spend some time. But are they pulling everyone aside? Because if you have questions, other people in the room probably have questions. And understanding that as a group is critical. Understanding it privately is not as helpful. And what if they didn't like you? Would they have pulled you aside, or would you have just been left to figure it out on your own?
Well, I should preface that towards the end of the meeting, the individual came forward in the meeting and was like, hey, if anyone has any questions, like, I've sat on such and such committees previously, like, I'm happy to share knowledge. And I think because, again, they're very much getting the sense that I walk into these meetings and I'm frustrated every single time. And it shows from my voice and how I am in the meetings, that like, it's getting to a point where, like, I don't know if other people find it disruptive and are reaching out to them to say so. So they're like, hey, maybe reach out to this person. I don't know. Like, I'm not taking it as any ill will from them. Like, I think they're genuinely wanting to make sure that I understand and have support in navigating this process. So I appreciate that. But I don't know if they've reached out to other people privately after the meeting. They just sent me an email after saying that, hey, if you want to sit down, I'm happy to do so. But they did also say in the meeting that if anybody else wants to do that, that they're happy to do that. So I think it was just a general thing. And then they reached out to me privately. I haven't responded yet because, to be honest, I was like so tired from this damn wedding, and had to go back to work yesterday. But I will reach out to them. Like, I think there's like an orientation that's of some points this evening. So I'm going to attend that. And I will reach out to them to say thank you. And perhaps I will sit down with them at some point. Like, I'm also trying to limit my time that I give to the party, just with everything else going on and how emotionally draining it's been for the past couple of months. But I did appreciate them reaching out to do that, because frankly, at this point, I haven't had that from anyone else.
That is encouraging. I hope that they are reaching out to the other new folks on the executive as well, because.
But the thing is, Jessa, no one else, from my understanding, comes forward in these meetings and say that they don't understand, to where they even think it's a problem. So maybe because I'm the only one who's very vocal and says, listen, I'm confused. I don't understand what's happening. They've extended the olive branch, so to speak. But that's why I was saying that, like, I would like other people to come forward and say that they also don't understand, so it doesn't seem like I'm the only one being difficult. Like, I genuinely feel that there's no way that every single person on the executive has a clear understanding of what is happening. So this, exactly as you said, this should be a wider conversation that we're all having together. And even if it's repetitive for you, then that's fine. Like, if we're an executive and we're supposed to be working together, how are we supposed to do that if not all of us are on the same page in terms of understanding the material that we've been elected to govern with and organize with? So
Exactly. And then how do you present something to council when you don't fully understand it yourself? But can you, I don't know if you want to wade into what your emotional labor has been like.
oh gosh, if I want
You
to,
started very optimistic, and
yeah.
you've talked about how uncomfortable it is, being that angry Black woman in the meeting and having to ask questions that other people need the answers to. What does that do to you as a person, as an activist?
um I don't know, like, it's obviously frustrating. Like, I'm definitely going into this space. I feel like I've come into this space with not a lot of understanding, and there's already kind of been a structure put forth, and there's an understanding from the people who've been there for X amount of years how this is going to go. But then again, how do you enact change and create process if not everyone is on the same page? And it's frustrating. Like, I don't want to have to leave a meeting every time and feel like I just, like, was arguing the weight of the world on my shoulders for like an hour or two. Like, it doesn't. And then you got to do all these motions and the Roberts rules and all of that fun stuff. And then, if you don't ask about emotion or something when it's presented, you don't ask about it again for such and such. Like, it's just, I get the procedure of it. Like, I understand, like, having an organizational process of those, of a meeting structure like that is important. But I also feel like, and I don't know why we don't have this at provincial council, or maybe I've just missed it. I don't understand why we don't have a parliamentarian or a councillor who's just there specifically to ensure we're abiding by Robert's rules and can recite the Constitution like the back of their hand, so that when there's disagreement or clarification is needed, they're just there to have those. Like, they have those at the school board meetings that I watch, and I think it's effective in terms of making sure that we're actually following process and procedure. Like, why don't we have those during our executive meetings for more clarification and for assistance, so we can easily ask this person, hey, I want to ask such and such, is this within rules or whatever, or just to make sure that we're doing things correctly, and also make sure that we're, like, keeping with time, because when we don't understand things, that which we saw last week with our provincial council meeting, like, things are also delayed in terms of time. And I know that a lot of people take time out of their evenings to attend these meetings and be productive and speak on behalf of their constituents or whatever. But yeah, I don't really have another way to describe it, just as frustrating. I don't want to say demoralizing, because I don't think it's demoralizing. Like, I absolutely have a right to ask questions, and whether or not those questions are asked, I feel like in any way, shape, or form, I will ask them, because it's important for me to do so for my own understanding, but also for the people who it is I'm entrusted to advocate for. But yeah, that's yeah. And then the kind of, like, the what I find sometimes is when, like, I feel like other people are questioning, like, other people are, it seems like they're either confused or upset as to, like, why we're questioning the process. I don't know if it's because the process works for them or they understand it better, but, like, I also find that to be a little disheartening as well. Like, just because we're used to doing something a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. And if someone is coming, whether it's from an accessibility um, or an equity lens or not, to say that, I don't actually think that this works for everyone. Is there a way that we can do it differently or involve more people who are actually impacted by the process to ensure we're making an informed decision? Like, I don't think that that's something that should be chalked up to, well, these people have decided on this, so therefore we should be accepting this, or this is how this has been done, so this is how we're going to continue to do it, type thing. Like, you never get progress like that. And then if we're not going to get progress, then there's no point of us having an executive, quite frankly.
I question that a lot. I do appreciate you're there and asking questions, but from Tara's testimony, that the provincial director, Lucy Watson, was able to delay convention and make, with contrary to her constitution, and make other major decisions, openly telling the executive that she does not need their approval to overrule the Constitution. So I found that shocking, because then it does beg the question, what is the point of the executive? And you talked about a parliamentarian. We should have one on the payroll. I believe we do. They're most noticeable during convention, but funny, not funny, when the chair is challenged, or where there is a question that would relate back to the parliamentarian, the chair actually discusses this in private with them and then comes back with the ruling. Very rarely are we presented with the parliamentarian and their explanation. So
I didn't even know. I didn't even know that.
We do have that expense on the budget.
Oh, wow.
And but it's not for us, it's for staff to consult, and they're not accessible, to members or to the executive, from what I've heard from previous executives. So you're 100% right, and it is part of how this organization should work, except like everything else, the access to that is limited, and there is no transparency whatsoever. Does it surprise you the provincial director can override the Constitution without the approval of the executive?
Well, yeah, because then again, what's the point of us being there? And then what's the point of even having a provincial council? Like, what's the point of having rules if the governing bodies that are elected or assigned to uphold said rules can't do so effectively because they can just be overridden at any time? Sometimes, I mean, if we're looking at in the grand scheme of things in terms of how that structure is, like in terms of situations where, it could cause like harm, or there's a need to do it due to whatever unforeseen circumstances, fine. But these are situations where that's not that, and there's no reason for rules to be overridden in that way without there being a democratic process. So that's news to me. I don't really understand, appreciate, approve of, accept any of that.
Well, maybe
I don't know why we're not consulting provincial council more in terms of these decisions, instead of just like, again, giving them things and just being like for instance, this debrief committee that I've constantly been bringing up does not make sense to me. Instead of saying that these are the people who are going to be on the debrief committee, why didn't we just vote on a structure of who should sit on said committee, which is what I suggested in a motion that I recently brought up, to include like people from every equity seeking group, making sure they're current NDP members. Like, why didn't we do something like that and put forth a suggested structure or composition, and then have the actual provincial council like vote on them, like little things like that, or even it even would have allowed them an opportunity to be part of that committee, which I think is important in terms of the democratic process. Because if we know anything about debriefing for this last election, is how members of our disabled committee are going to be like, yeah, we definitely were consulted on things weren't accessible, and look at the policies we put forward that were literally going to put us into legislative poverty. So, but we don't want to make sure that there's at least one or two people from that committee on the, like, it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense.
No, I feel your frustration, and I've heard it from so many other folks that are either sitting on it now or have been. This doesn't seem to be unique to Ontario, Akuah, because Jay speaks of very similar experiences around getting an email address to be accessible, getting information in time to process it before a meeting, having a nice safe space where asking questions is encouraged as part of the process. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the way it's done within the NDP at the moment. I'm hopeful that with people like you and Kamal and Helen, especially here in Ontario, pushing for answers, have great ideas for changes that we can make that would make it more democratic, more accessible to members. So, I know it's frustrating, but a lot of people do appreciate what you're doing. And I wish I was on that executive with you, Akuah. I would be asking those questions. You wouldn't I would not let you flounder. Like, not that you're floundering, that's such a bad, the way
Oh
that you
no,
have to
trust me, I get
stand out,
it.
like the way you
Yeah,
have to put yourself out there, it's uncomfortable. I understand that. I don't understand it from, I'm not a Black woman, obviously,
yeah.
right? I wouldn't have that trope attached to me. But it does break my heart when I hear that when we do get really good people on the executive, there's just not enough of them together to make them feel the strength they need to really do it,
Yeah.
so
And
that
I should
you,
know that no one specifically has made me feel like I'm being an angry Black woman. That's just something that I personally feel like I am coming across. Like that no one has said anything disparaging to me or anything of that sort. Like it's not like there's no abuse there. Like I want to preface that. Because I'd be very honest, I actually don't know a lot of people on the executive. Like I would only interact with them during those meetings. I don't know what they've done previously and such like that. So I think they're also maybe there's a need for us to be us to get to know each other in a more social environment where we can understand where people are coming from. Because again, we only got to really hear about each other through our speeches, and then we would have been subsequently elected. So I actually don't know a lot of people I've been elected to um, organize with, which I think also makes a difference. Like I know Kamal and Helen because I interact with them outside of executive. I've gotten to know them as people, and they're absolutely phenomenal. But I think with that, and perhaps what I'm like a little perturbed about is that like if we've all run on this guise of wanting to be advocates and speaking up for our members and such, then like when I would say two of arguably the most impacted people on our executive, the disability co-chairs are constantly coming forward and saying that there are issues with accessibility. It is not on them to be bringing that forward. It is actually our responsibility as people who are in the point of privilege to ensure that those voices and those concerns are being brought forward so they don't have to bear the emotional labor of having to advocate for basic needs. And that's what I am confused about as to why I don't feel enough people are speaking out about. Again, maybe it's because they're processes and procedures that they're already comfortable with, and maybe I'm not. But I would like more of that. Like it's not just the rules, right? Like it's how the rules are structured, it's how those rules get structured, it's who is involved in structuring those rules. Like that's like it's that piece. Um, so that's what's upsetting to me. Like they shouldn't have to bear. It's the same thing. If I was coming forward constantly about anti-Black racism on whether it was the executive or in the party in general, that shouldn't be on me to bring forward or continue to have to advocate for it. That should be on everybody else who is not Black and is of privilege because they're not Black and have to face that, to be supporting and bringing those concerns forward. Or again, if you were a member of the LGBTQ plus, you know what I mean? Like it
yep.
just
Yeah, that
so
heavy lifting you always have to do, right? Especially in a progressive space of activists who should be able to recognize ableism, anti-Black racism, you know, when it's there.
and again, it's not coming from the executive. It's bringing forth things that have happened outside of the executive to the executive to bring to the just like in terms of knowledge sharing. But yeah.
Yeah. In terms of, yeah, and I think knowledge sharing, and you brought up a good point about making connections with your fellow organizers on the executive. I think that would be a good place to start, Akuah, but I'll tell you that's something you and your fellow executives would have to facilitate on your own.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you why I know that for sure, because I spoke to a former MPP who explained just how these caucus retreats work and how MPPs were purposely siloed away from one another uh, throughout their term. There was no effort to connect MPPs together to even in a social way, in a knowledge sharing way. And when they attend these retreats, it is just like attending convention. Everything is scripted, orchestrated. Access to the mic is limited, speakers are already lined up to talk about how great that new idea from Andrea is, and just like convention, and they're treated in a very similar way as executives and members when they show up. They're talked at, and the space that they're given to express themselves is very limited. And like I said, there's no attempt to connect them to each other. So that the Black Caucus that formed, that was them making those connections themselves. That wasn't party facilitated. And deeper connections across other, whether it's regional or issue based, just are not happening. And there's also no knowledge sharing from the members, from the equity committees that we have, to the MPPs that are tabling private member bills and trying to find solutions that would affect these marginalized groups. There's no attempt to use the membership or these committees as any kind of resource for the MPPs as well. So any kind of change that way, or those connections that you want to make so that you guys can act as a team, and maybe you could understand the folks around you, that will have to be that labor that you do outside. You're going to have to give that much extra time if that is to be a solution. So
like, even if it's just a Zoom call on like a Sunday night where everyone says like their favorite color, like their favorite book, something that's made them happy over the last week or so, like just something like that. Like, I don't know anything about anybody, you know what I mean? And I like, it's awkward. Like, it's not, I don't know. I think that's awkward.
Well, it's easier to ask questions amongst friends.
Yes,
you feel more
absolutely.
Comfortable. That's why we make connections. That's what New Demo Chat was. It just put people together sometimes is really the biggest step you can take. And so, yeah, the most frustrating part is this limited access to people, to information. I mean, it just seems so counterintuitive to positive change, right? Like, I just don't know how we will accomplish great things if we don't take the great people on our executive and the members and put them together with the MPPs and be this like collaborative network that we could be. And it's so frustrating to hear, processes and whatnot kind of getting in the way or being inaccessible. So, Akuah, is there anything else as we kind of wrap up that you think folks would like to know or need to know about the power structure? That's really what this episode is mostly about, is the power structure that's within the NDP and that has Democratic in its name.
I would say continue asking questions. Always, always ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. There's no such thing as a silly question, especially when it comes to organizational processes, policies, and procedures that impact your everyday life. And a lot of people don't think that, oh, well, you don't have to be part of a political party. Apathy at this point in the game is I want to be very mindful about how I say this, because I understand that people are apathetic because they've been directly impacted by this, and I don't mean it for those people. I mean people who are in a point of privilege. Being apathetic at a time like this is like, it's not. We can't have that. Like, the more people we have speaking up about these things, the better, because again, that's how we actually get change and that's how we get things done. And we need to be doing it for people who, because of how the processes and structures are put in place, are disadvantaged and are therefore apathetic. So continue asking questions. I don't care if we have to be on Zoom calls for provincial council all night. I'm sure at some point we'll all tire ourselves out and maybe just leave the meeting, but ask those questions. Because I guarantee if you're asking that question, somebody else is asking that question as well, to the point where I actually got 2 messages from people like privately on Facebook after that, our last provincial council, being like, hey, thanks for asking that question, because I wouldn't have thought to do so, or I didn't feel comfortable doing so. So even if you don't think it makes a difference, if somebody reaches out to you after, it does make a difference. So continue to do so. And I'm happy to support anyone to bring forward things to executive that they want clarification on, or at any way, shape, or form. I mean, that's why I was elected. I like being someone who helps others navigate spaces, because I know how helpful it's been when people have helped me to do so. And so that's, I feel like, what I was elected to do, and that's what I'm here to do. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Akuah, for taking the time to come on here, because I think it will help folks navigate the space of the Ontario NDP as well as the current work that you're doing. And just generally, I think partisan politics, it's important to kind of shed light on how parties work, how they form policy, how they make decisions, how they change who they are, and just exactly who is making those decisions. So eventually we'll get to the bottom of it, Akuah. And I'm sure you're going to learn a lot more during your term as Central East co-chair. Thank you very much for your time and for all of your efforts.
And thank you so much, Jessa, for just like, honestly, just having the space that you do. I can't stress enough to people how amazing it is to have support from people in New Demochat, people I've never even met, like literally besides outside of that space, like you and I have never met. And I like consider you like a dear colleague who just like, anytime I need a clarification or something, especially you and Jay have just been so incredibly helpful. So I can't thank you enough for providing safe, accessible spaces for people to just be themselves and talk about how, not even when it's just issues in the party, but just in general. Like, I don't think, I mean, you probably know how much of an impact you have already, but I can't thank you enough for the space.
Don't get me all emotional now, Akuah. No, I'm driven by the same frustrations that you feel. So I hearing that it helps is everything. You must know that, right? So thank you.
Thank you so much.
So it was important to hear from Akuah, to hear about what drives people to get within the party structure to try to change it, and their perspective on what it's like when you first get there. Now, next we're going to hear from Tara, who's going to give us some concrete examples and instances that really demonstrate the power structure within the Ontario NDP. Because what she provides are ideas that were brought forth and things that happened that should have been driven by the members, but were essentially controlled by one person. And this position that we keep talking about that is so problematic is the provincial director position. And one exists on the federal level. Jay will get into that as well, the national director. And it is astonishing that within a democratic structure, one that then shapes the electoral left here in Canada, is so tightly controlled by so few people with such a lack of transparency. And I say that because most members are sitting out there thinking that they shape the party. Those petitions they sign, the conventions they go to, all of that helps shape the NDP. Or maybe they think the leaders shape the NDP, but there is just so much that is decided by one person. And, so let's just listen into Tara. She provides testimony, so to speak, and I think it'll be quite eye-opening.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tara King. I have about 4 years of experience within the party. I was a candidate in the 2018 election. I've been president of our riding association. I was a rural rep for our region, a federal campaign manager, and then a delegate at council. I attended convention as a delegate, and finally I sat on provincial executive. And so I just want to tell you a few stories of my experiences in basically as our regional rep on the provincial executive. So the first one I want to talk about is the situation that happened coming after the anti-Black racism training. That was a really great initiative, I want to point out. And our disability rep at the time had made a motion to, on the floor of the executive, to enact or have a report about how we can implement disability sensitivity training, which I thought was a great idea, especially coming out of our anti-Black racism training. It was a nice lead-in into continuing that sensitivity training and for specifically disability. When the member made that motion, there was lots of issues around Robert's rules and how the motion was not proper, and that basically that member, their motion was shot down. And that I remember very vividly that Lucy had said to this member, we'll connect privately, and you and I can discuss how we may implement something along these lines. So let's set up a time to talk privately, you and I. So I will leave that. Another situation was some members from my region had reached out to me as their rep, one of their reps, to implement a women's organizer and an ethno-racial organizer, which have been on our policy book since 1980, maybe 1982, and saying, I think the ethno-racial organizer was 1986 was the first time it was put into our policy book. However, once the Women's Committee put the motion forward to ask for a women's organizer and an ethno-racial organizer to be hired, because we had heard time and time again about how we had all this money, and essentially the motion to hire a women's organizer and an ethno-racial rep or organizer was basically shot down. And looking back, reading the motion now, says nothing about a women's organizer. Basically, the motion was reworded to say, and I sent this to you, Jessa, you can read it if more context is needed. Basically, the Women's Committee was asking the director, Lucy Watson, to write a report about how the party applies an equity lens to everything we did. So the essence of the motion totally was removed. And that at convention, that was one of the first policies to be sunshined, was the women's organizer. So it's no longer on our policy book. The next thing I want to talk about is the convention that was moved from September 2021 to February 2022. And I understand that there's an overall understanding that the executive, provincial executive, made that decision. And I want to be clear that that was not executive's position at that time. We were presented with that option by Lucy, and Lucy had talked about a number of reasons why it was important to move convention from September 2021 to February 2022. The most, in my opinion, at that time, important at the top of Lucy's list was that we would have the ability to likely meet in person at that time. I also very clearly remember a colleague suggesting, this was right before provincial council, suggesting that as the executive, we write a report supporting Lucy's decision to move convention from September 2021 to February 2022. To which Lucy responded, no, that's not necessary. I don't need your report. This is an action that I can take without your support, essentially. Maybe not in so many words, but that was the message we received. So no recommendation was written from the executive because it was going to happen regardless. There was no vote on moving that. No members on the executive had a vote to move convention. I want to be very clear about that. The last thing I want to point out was that we revoked 2 memberships on that 1 year time that I was on executive, because I was in a by-election. So I only had, a year and a bit remaining. And so we revoked 2 memberships. I won't talk about the specifics, but one of the members that had their membership revoked asked for an independent review. So Mary Rita did the investigation. She determined that those memberships should be revoked. And then when those members one member asked for an independent review, it was determined that Lucy Watson would be completing that independent review. Of course, I pointed out that I didn't believe that was a viable option, as that was not an independent review. So in my experience sitting on provincial executives, I felt that I was always being talked at, that there was no real effort to hear what each rep was bringing to the table. Our conversations were muted, and we have to remember that during this time was during COVID, so every meeting was on Zoom. We were not meeting in person at all. Oftentimes, regional reports and sometimes equity reports were cut short because we ran out of time. And looking back at some of the agendas, like even allocating the time was like 10 minutes for reports. And this is reports to our director and our president, and certainly not enough time to communicate these we are important aspects of the functionality of this organization is bringing our voices from our regions or equity groups. Is that not the purpose, to hear what we have to say? So I also remember, so I guess this would be another example, was that Lucy had instructed all the reps or executives not to ask staff to do too much for us if we needed something, because they were already tied up doing other very important things, which to me communicated that we were not important. What we needed from staff, we weren't considered important. And so what we had to say, therefore, was not important. So as the Southwest rep, one of them, I did take every opportunity to take up space for a region that I was representing. I thought that was very important. So if you ever remember going back to any of the provincial councils, I always made a verbal report because that was the only time that I could represent the region effectively. Outside of that, even at provincial councils, our reports would be cut short to make space for the president's report or the leader's report or something else. And so our reports would just be filed in the paperwork that I don't know if anybody ever even looked at. So I did ask at one point to be connected to the other regional reps because we didn't even have that connection on executive. And that was one of the last meetings that I went to. And because at the end of October, I essentially stepped away from my executive duties and never got communications from anyone about how we could connect or emails, or that they even wanted to connect, or that we could have a connection outside of executive and have meetings outside of executive. So, we could talk about how our regions were similar, how they were different, how instead of taking up time reporting things that are happening across Ontario as opposed to just regions. But unfortunately, that never came to fruition. So I also have a note here about accessibility. We requested accessibility to non-delegates for provincial council and even convention, so that non-delegates, especially because it was virtual, that non-delegates could attend, especially committee meetings and regional meetings. So, of course, if they can't afford to attend provincial council or convention, that they can still participate as a member and it doesn't cost them anything. That was really important to me. That I think that because of Zoom, that was implemented, I think, at one of the last provincial councils, but I'm not sure if it's going to continue outside of, now COVID is allegedly over. So the last thing I want to point out is that I understand that there are criticisms around us speaking out about publicly criticizing the party and speaking out about the problems within the party. And I want to take this opportunity to say that it's my party too. I'm a member, I'm a paying member, and I'm not happy about the way things are. And I spent 4 years in the party. At the beginning, I had said I was a candidate, president of the Riding Association, rural rep for the region, federal campaign manager, delegate at council, and then finally sat on provincial executive and I did that because I seen problems coming out of the 2018 election. Something is what seemed very, big to me, but probably small to the leaders, that I didn't even receive a phone call until October to thank me for running. And in a volunteer-run organization, it's very important to thank your volunteers, and it costs nothing. So instead of doing nothing about these problems that I've seen back in 2018, I felt like by sitting on these committees, being active in the party, I felt that at least now I was doing something about it. And I tried to affect change from the inside, but the problem is deeply systemic. Membership does not have the power. The Ontario NDP is authoritarian. The membership has this illusion of power, right? Just like, but the reality is that only a couple people at the top are dictating and holding all the control.
Thank you, Tara. I wonder if you knew, and I believe this, sometimes council can be a blur, but I believe they voted to keep provincial council virtual.
Like indefinitely.
Yeah, it's cheaper and it allows people from across the province, but we also have to remember it allows them to keep that chat closed and mute us and decide who gets to get up at the mic without anybody knowing, who's waiting.
Yeah.
So it's much easier.
I believe in accessibility and having that option, but I believe it can be achieved through a hybrid version of provincial council. Those that can afford to attend in person or can attend in person logistically should be available or should be able to do that in order to make those connections, because that's how I met people and found like-minded people. When you restrict the flow of information and those connections, you're just creating a bubble of people that aren't going to challenge the status quo.
Well, you hit it right there, right? Some people think it's just a lack of resources, or, they just don't have, forward-minded organizers leading the pack. But the reality is it's definitely a deliberate control and a siloing because, I don't know if we'll use this on this show, but talking to, let's just say, a former MPP about what the environment is like for them. And I think I was shocked to learn that they are also siloed from us and from each other. It's not encouraged that they talk to each other outside the official channels. The retreats that we hear about are really just as, or it was described to me as just like council, just like convention. It's just completely orchestrated. Whoever's going to talk, that's been lined up ahead of time. They have almost a very similar experience. And I think I was naive. I thought that they would be a little more empowered than us, but it really just is that handful of folks. Some we know their names, some we just kind of know by reference. But yeah, I was shocked. So,
and I agree with you, Jessa. Like, was I just naive coming into this in 2018 and being like, or did they do a really good job? I guess like spreading misinformation about the structure of the party and how we're a party for the working class. And they did a really great job pulling the wool over my eyes. And so I was quite surprised, even during the 2018 election, reaching out to Central, like asking for, print material. Can you make this? Can you make that? I really thought, my honest thought was that the riding associations ran the campaigns with the support of Central. Or because I'm an educator.
Depends on where you live, Tara.
Yeah, exactly. I'm an educator, so in my brain, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Like, we've done this before. Why isn't there something like a program in place? Do this, do X, Y, and Z. If this is what you need, radio ads, this is where you go to. This is the rates for across the province. Why are we reinventing the wheel, the campaign wheel, every election? So I'm all about working smarter, not harder. But when you're not listening to members and their ideas, how do you change if you're just going to continue doing the same thing over and over and over again? And I think that was really frustrating for me. I had sacrificed 4 years of my life, time with my children, time with my husband, with my students, that I could be, even time in my community that I could have been putting that time in my community to improve the community that I live in, as opposed to putting the time into this party that I feel like was a fabrication of lies.
You say one thing there that kind of hit on something. I think it was a tweet this morning, but it's something I've heard many, many, many times, and I can't help but buy into it myself. Is the criticism or the conspiracy theory that the NDP essentially just sucks the energy of the left and allows them like hamsters to just spin needlessly and tirelessly and with no momentum. Like there's no gain, rather. And you talked about like not having to reinvent the campaign plan, and folks were also talking about not needing to reinvent the platform every 4 years. I mean, we've not made that many gains. We still have the same goals of expanding the public sector and all that jazz. And quite literally, it seems like it's thrown together at the last minute with, piecemeal stuff. And we know why, right? Well, there's so many, that's another discussion altogether, but there's just so many parallels. Like, it's just like this pattern that applies.
Yeah, what do you think? I really thought that sitting on executive, I was going to be able to be like, do more for my community. And I was the rural rep. Like, I live in Oxford. We're an agricultural community. And I was like, okay, in order to win these rural communities, we need to focus on a rural strategy. And it just blew my mind that, like, do they not know that we need to focus some of our policies on that to reach those voters? Or are they ignorant, or do they not want to listen? Like, I didn't understand, and that was really frustrating to me. And so, yeah, you just, like, you get, what is the word? Like, just ground down until there's nothing left of you. And you're drained. Your energy tank is drained. And why continue to put that effort or investment into something that you're not getting a return on that investment? I'm not making change for my community by being the rural rep or sitting on provincial executive I'm not making change that way. I'm not affecting any real change for my community. So I had a really, really hard time in this 2022 election because I was trying to take a stand and not assist with the campaign. Like, it wasn't that I brought all these volunteers. I think these volunteers in Oxford brought themselves. We all came together with a common goal. At the 2019 convention, maybe it was 2018, whatever that convention was, year, we brought 11 delegates from Oxford. And I remember...
To Hamilton?
Yeah, to Hamilton. We brought 11 delegates from Oxford. We didn't have that many members to have that many delegates, but we just borrowed, delegation status from other riding associations. We had 11 Oxford members there, and we were all young. Like, I would say all under 40 years old. I say that's young. So, and some as young as 16 years old, 16 or 17 years old. And I remember Jesse McCauley saying, like, at registration, how did you get this many delegates here? Well, like, do you really want to know? No, she didn't want to know. Like, it was just, how did you do it? Well, I have the answer, but you don't want to listen to me. I didn't say that at the time, but looking back, I'm like, I could tell you, like, we just had a commonality. We had the same goals. We were further left-leaning than what the party is, and we wanted to make those changes. We saw that there was some hope. We all had hope. We all had this drive and this passion to make our community better. And not one of those people, yes, sorry, I lied, one person remains on executive from those 11 people. And it's just it's sad, right? They just push out those activists.
It's the same, yeah, like Tara, that's almost the copycat story of my riding, although we didn't have, I think we only had 5 delegates in Hamilton in 2019, but just the, when we became like openly socialist, so I ran twice as an open socialist, right? And it was incredible that our executive grew with young folks. that were willing to put in the work. But then it became clear we would just keep butting up against bureaucracy. And I was perfectly candid with my group, when HQ would do what they do, and we just kept losing them. And times are tough too, right? People needed to work when they didn't want to work, and COVID, pulled a whole new thing. But yeah, it really has dwindled. And I could not participate in the 2022, in the most recent elections either. There was no way. I could not, for 1 second, tell anyone to vote for Andrea and her team, knowing what they had done to my friends, knowing how they run a government within themselves. I fear, actually, because I've talked to people who have worked in other parties, and just very candid conversations off the record. They've never seen anything like this. This is not normal. And I think it's because they have to manage a lot of activists. Like, liberals are just like, oh, everything's gravy, Canada. And then the right is like, I won't even get into that. But I mean, they're not pushing for real change, and they're not rabble rousers, and speaking truth to power doesn't come maybe so naturally to them, right? They're okay with an authoritarian structure, but we are not, and their response is to just crack down. And yeah, the stories are just endless. So we've heard from Akuah, the perspective of somebody new to the Ontario NDP executive, and we heard from Tara King, who immersed herself in the executive and demonstrated just exactly how it operates and how the power structure is completely top down. Now we're going to talk to our old friend Jay. Jay was on our previous episode talking about the candidate crisis, and he's back on to share his perspective as an executive on the federal NDP. Welcome back, Jay.
Thank you.
You've told us before, but can you remind us just what is your role federally and how did you get it?
I am a federal executive by way of being elected a co-chair of the Federal Disability Committee. I am also now co-chair of the Accessibility Committee and a council member.
All right. And you also have experience on the Ontario NDP. So, when we talk about the two women's experience that were on earlier, that won't be new to you either as a federal executive or as someone who has seen kind of exactly what happens firsthand at Ontario Provincial Council. Now, Akuah shared her perspective on being new to the game, so to speak, and the frustration that she experiences navigating all of the processes. And this is your first term on the federal executive. What was it like for you to enter that space? Was it welcoming? Did you understand what you were getting yourself into and how you would insert yourself, or did you have to navigate that yourself?
I got courted by the party and different members through my advocacy on disability-related topics. So getting elected co-chair of the Disability Committee, which also makes you an executive, I genuinely thought that I would be able to not take control of the many issues, because that convention where I was elected was an ableist nightmare. They had to give refunds to disabled delegates. They had to apologize. It was horrible. So coming through that traumatizing experience, and I am the executive by way of the Disability Committee, I thought accessibility, disability, it's going to get dealt with. As being elected the top member voice in that and having a presence on executive, everything is going to have a disabled perspective. So that's what I was going into, and I went into it with that being my guiding process, where I had itemized this long list of these are the things that's going to get dealt with. and not knowing, you don't get some kind of welcome booklet. They don't tell you this is your role, this is your duty. They don't give you any actual onboarding. It's just a welcome meeting where they don't focus on business. They focus on, hey, high five everybody. And that's pretty much what every meeting since has been. So I
Every
really,
meeting of the federal executive?
any meeting that staff put together anywhere. But yes, it has been, I have been absolutely, I am so confused as how people can form the executive, and we had the federal election, a time when it's go, 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 let's accomplish our dreams. And there was such a lack of desire, there was such a lack of passion, and no one seems to have any interest in actually doing anything. Everyone seems to be filling a role of placeholder.
Interesting. I kind of did a little chuckle there. I don't think I realized that they had folks within the establishment had courted you, because Akuah shared the same thing, and I think to myself, did they understand what they were doing? I imagine anyone that encouraged the two of you to join the executive perhaps is now regretting it, considering the drive that you two have to actually make reforms. That's troubling, Jay, because I think if you talk to most members, as we do, Jay and I, that's almost feels like all we do sometimes, is talk to folks about how the party can change. And it's clear to most people there's just like a lot of work to be done. And I think when we elect these folks and they give these great speeches, that we think that they understand this too, and they must see that we are a losing party. So clearly there's work to do, but Akuah had the same impression, a bit of apathy. It is what it is, and you describe it as a placeholder. Are you satisfied with the role as a placeholder?
I think the better way of framing that actually is the executive is tokenized members, because we all come from regions, we come from equity committees, we come from very specific demographics, and it's kind of, well, they exist, so shut up. So a placeholder would actually be the wrong way of saying that, because that means like holding a place for someone else to come do something. Like in Ontario, Peter Tabbins is currently a placeholder for whoever is elected, but that leader is going to do things. So to be a placeholder is to hold the spot for, yes, is to hold the spot for someone who's going to come do things, but that's not really what we're doing. We aren't laying
Jay, are you a
groundwork for
mascot
anything.
then? Because is that a better word? Yeah, you throw that word a lot around when we talk about political leaders.
I'm not a mascot because I don't sit there going, rah, 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 we are amazing, join us, we
You're
can do no
supposed to,
wrong.
though.
Sorry, not supposed to. That's what is expected.
I'm just teasing you. You know that,
Yeah,
right? Okay.
absolutely. But the reality is you're teasing staff and certain members of the executive. That's exactly what they expect. Show up, cheerlead, go away.
So I want to get into something, because when we spoke to Akuah, she talked about asking questions. So, there was no real onboarding to explain all the processes, how one would, get a motion onto the agenda so that they could be heard. Really simple things like that. And how that made her feel as a person, how, she described it as, being that angry Black woman in the room. Now, she said that nobody there had made her feel that way, but that there's a certain uncomfort level with always having to be the one asking the questions. Now, has that been your experience? How have you, now I know you, and anybody who's listened to the show knows you a little bit. And of course, I was teasing Jay when I asked him if he'd be content being a placeholder, because no, you clearly, you talked about having a real mission in place and drive to make change. Now that you're there and been a little bit stymied, you know, how has the party structure made you feel?
So with what Akuah was explaining, I am the annoying disabled guy.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not saying that this is she said it so perfectly. No one is specifically making me feel like I'm the annoying disabled guy, but the result of the way they have treated me, when everything I am doing is trying to make the party more accessible for members, to target the disabled community with messaging and to empower them, and I'm blocked and I'm rejected and I'm ignored and stonewalled and all of that, you're left to identify yourself what they're doing this for, because it makes no sense. So for me, I'm used to ableism being what people, what I don't know how to say this, not the motivation, but the dismissals and all of that stems from ableism. So the way that I am treated by staff in the executive, the only thing I can think of is, oh, it's the disability guy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how Akuah feels. Like nobody has provided any kind of label, but that it doesn't sit well. It doesn't seem to be what other folks had intended the space to be, you know, to be questioning, to be asking for accountability, more transparency, and that you actually come off as annoying rather than doing your job, right? I think most people would expect you to ask these questions as their representative or to demand certain accessibility requirements. But instead you're treated almost like a nuisance, right? A problem in the agenda rather than a meaningful part of it.
A perfect example is when we were talking about candidates and vetting and all of that. I had a large number of disabled identifying members who were trying to seek the nomination. They were either not given a package or not vetted. Now, when asking and dealing with the party on why it seems like so many disabled identifying members are not being rejected or are being rejected, if they're not willing to explain it to the people they are not vetting, they are left to determine why. And the thing that they have suffered the most discrimination or hate or attacks from is what they're going to assume. So for disabled seeking can people seeking the nomination who are disabled, who get rejected with no explanation, are going to feel it's ableism. So when you don't explicitly state, why are you treating me like shit, I'm left to determine why. And the main reason I have been treated like shit in many different spaces is I'm the annoying disabled guy. They have an agenda set out, very specific. Here's your rubber stamp, here's your rubber stamp. And then I say, hold on. And I come at it from a disabled perspective, and it annoys people. Their coffee's getting cold, their dinner's getting, whatever it is, whatever reason they don't want to actually discuss the agenda. I'm the annoying guy who brings up accessibility and disability. So I am actually filling my role properly, and it really annoys and pisses people off.
So if the executive is in practice a rubber stamp, you know, where questions and are treated as interruptions, who is making the decisions then? What are you rubber stamping?
So a very important note, a lot of people who make up the Ontario NDP make up the federal NDP. A large bulk of staff are federal staff, and people are affiliated in some way with the, or not affiliated, active in the Ontario NDP. So a lot of these issues are shared, and a lot of the processes whatever it is, are the same. And I don't understand how the members feel like the body that they elect, the executive, to represent all members in all matters in dealing with the party, the group that can hire, fire the provincial director or the federal director is there to be dictated to by the party. So the accountability group, the executive, is supposed to work with the staff on good and instantly remove the bad. But somehow we have, and to talk about the situation with the leadership race in Ontario, it explicitly states in the proposed rules that the director has the ultimate authority on who can and cannot run, when our constitution should not be overruled by a employment contract. So it doesn't state anywhere that the director is this magic overlord, but yet they're the ones who present things to they present it as if they are giving the executive choice, when the executive doesn't need their choices, doesn't need their permission. The executive dictates to the staff.
Because you haven't heard her testimony explicitly, but Tara talks about Lucy Watson completely being candid with the executive that she did not need their approval. So even, when it got down to the nitty gritty, there wasn't even a facade anymore. She was in front of the executive were willing to give her a rubber stamp in the form of an approving letter to move the convention date, and her response was, I don't need it. Thanks, but no thanks.
Imagine a staff member doing that, because again, the executive can fire the provincial director, and the provincial director is saying, I don't need you. I don't need your permission. My contract overrules your constitution and the word and wishes of thousands upon thousands of members.
I just want to remind people, back to the previous episode where we did the candidate crisis, and it was clear and laid bare that it is two people within the party that get to determine every single candidate, who is good, who is bad, who gets to run, and whatnot. We went into a lot of the issues there. So just to be clear, that same person, the provincial director, now gets to determine who can even put their hat in the race to be the next leader of the party, as well as they seem to have crafted the rules of such ahead of time. We're not going to get into all of those rules, right? We'll have another episode that talks about internal elections and democracy like that specifically. But I think to anybody who's heard that previous episode and understands democracy, that sounds really problematic. Is she not choosing her next boss, in essence?
The thing is, she's telling her current bosses, which are the executive and therefore council and all members, that she gets to determine who we choose as our leader.
I know you say the executive can fire and by constitution, but how is that possible if the director can override the constitution? Wouldn't they be able to manipulate any process that would be set up to remove them?
There is a petition, and full disclosure, I authored it, calling for the resignation or removal of the provincial director in Ontario. More people have signed it than are members of the executive. And I spoke with the interim leader about tabling a motion. Here's the petition. It was reviewed, and he said, well, sorry, I don't have the authority or the process to remove this person. The executive does. So I posed him the question of, well, how do the members have their say when the executive is not tabling the motion, not hearing the motion? They're not even accessible. I was told that now I have to send an email to a party-controlled executive at ontarionDP.ca and hope that the staff give that message to whomever it is supposed to go to.
Akuah touched on that, gave out that email address if folks ever wanted to get in touch. And clearly that's a problem when we're talking about issues with senior staff and them now being able to filter through emails and pass them on at their whim.
I want to just side note here. I had gotten a list of emails for the Ontario executives, and I sent them my petition and the request to add the motion to the upcoming council agenda to vote on removing the provincial director. So
How was that received?
Angrily. It is not. There was supposedly backlash for the executive because they just assumed that it was an executive who shared it when it wasn't. But because they do not have any way for members to get in touch with the people they elected to represent them, they got angry and are investigating how I got those emails. And now they've got this gatekeeping executive at Ontario NDP, whatever, so that they are in control of how members communicate with their elected representatives.
Sounds like a thriving democracy.
Yeah.
So let's say we're examining the federal party just for a moment and forget about what it's supposed to be. Forget about what the Constitution says. In your mind, after sitting on the federal executive for the NDP, who runs the show?
Being wholly ignorant of what goes on behind the closed doors.
Okay.
That we speak out against all the time.
And there's many closed doors. I understand that.
The person at every door, the person between, I'll speak from my personal experience, the person between me and all these decisions that are being made that we should be informed of and have input on is the federal director. So it's not the president, it's not the leader, it's not staff on the leader. The person who is always traffic controlling who gets in, who doesn't, is the director.
That's a perfect analogy there. So I think most people would assume, because when we have gripes with the party, and we've got gripes, we typically, and I mean just the broader membership, typically blame the leader, right? That's the most front-facing. Federally, we'll chirp at Jagmeet online, or we blame Andrea for the poor election results. And I think it's important that people know that although bad leaders allow bad management around them, they're not the ones that are actually making any of these decisions. I've spoken to MPs and MPPs who have provided a bit of an insight into caucus. I've shared some of those here, but it is very similar to our experience as members, where access to decision-making is tightly controlled, that agendas for meetings are set well ahead of time with no intention of it being altered to any great degree. And Akuah mentions not really understanding where any of these processes come from. Maybe Lucy hands it to the executive, but she knows the provincial director's not sitting there crafting all of these by themselves. And so even people that are within the executive don't understand exactly who is making all of these decisions and who is structuring the internal democracy of the party. Because most people would think that happens at convention. I mean, we don't have enough time to get into that farce, but front-facing with very little exposure, one would think members are playing a role in this party. But, from talking to Akuah, from hearing the damning testimony from Tara on how any efforts from the executive, which were bolstered by the Constitution, were vetoed, it's clear that it's just a very small group of people making the decisions, and we're not completely sure who all is involved, but we just know who is not, right? And that's the members. Now, you went in with a mission, and I know you're idealistic. You have a vision of how it should be, and you're pretty determined to get there. How has it been for you? Akuah talked about emotional labor involved and how, one would have to limit their exposure to the party like I have, or, the heavy lifting that needs to get done and how that wears on you. Can you dip into the personal a little and tell us, what has that done to you as an activist, as a person who has gone into a so-called progressive space with great ideas, bolstered by the members? You were voted by them. They had confidence in you to do this. And you've hit a lot of brick walls. You've had some success. I don't want to diminish that. And please, share them with us if you'd like to do that. But to a large part, it's been frustrating for everyone we've heard from today and beyond. But what is that doing to you as a person and an activist? Is it tearing you down? Is it building you up? Give us some insight, Jay.
So I'll give a couple of quick examples. So instead of just saying this is how it impacts me, my first fight was for an email, an NDP.ca email, so that the members who elected me, and any member as an executive, every member has a right to me. It took me months to fight for that email, for an email. And then from there, it was fighting to get the party to bring up the struggles of the disabled community leading up to and during the election. And then it's about making sure that events are actually accessible. And there was a fight to have, during the nomination meetings, fundraising events and all of that, of the lead up to and during the federal election, to have an input field. So not demanding that they actually accommodate every accommodation request, just to have a simple field added to NDP events was a few months and a lawsuit or a threat of a lawsuit from a human rights lawyer to actually get an input field on events.
I just want to clarify what that is. So, when you register an event and they ask you your name and your email, often in good organizations, there's a question on what can we do to help you access this meeting better? Whether that's closed captioning, materials in advance, there's a space, a field for you to then say what you need to be able to fully participate in that event. Okay? Just for listeners.
And this is coming off of when I say I was courted to run. This is members of caucus. This is candidates and members of the party in many different capacities, building up this. You will do so good in that space. You're going to be able to actually give a pipeline for the members to have their say and be heard. And I went in there thinking accessibility isn't just a disability related issue. So I'm going to present it to them. They're going to love it, and we're going to start making the party better. So it's not about me trying to do all of these self-serving things. It's about, hey, I want to help this party have more members and be better and not break either human rights laws or in Ontario, the AODA. There's rules about or laws about not discriminating against the disabled community by being inaccessible. So then I have had the laundry list of reasons and dismissals and ignored emails. Each time it is me talking with like-minded people who want this party to be better and win. These are people who are marginalized people who have fought for space and access and information. And now, and I've posed this to some of these people. And what I say is, you, in your fight to get to where you are, you have sat across a table from someone who is saying the most disgusting things to you and hurt you so deeply. And you would go home that night and just sit there broken, depressed, crying, emotional about why are these people doing that? And what you have done is you've gotten up and you conquered it. You took that chair from the person who was sitting across from you, but now you're doing the same thing to me. It never lands well. They obviously don't want to talk to me after. But that's the reality check that a lot of these people need, is they have become what they hated.
They say that often happen, with power, right? Like that is one of the big critiques of power. It breeds corruption, right? It breeds... Go ahead.
That to me, like, yes, there's merits to that, but that removes the individual choice and responsibility. These people are making the choice to do that. So is it power corrupts or power brings out the corruption that already existed? Because someone with morals and ethics, I don't see them being corrupt, especially when, in all honesty, we're talking about executives and staff members. These people aren't powerful. Maybe if we won an election, they could consider themselves powerful, but we're not even the opposition.
But Jay, I think to members, though, they are powerful in that they act as impenetrable gatekeepers at the moment, right? Like counts, I'm just going to quickly share. I was really, when Andrea resigned and, 10 days had gone by and we hadn't had one email from the Ontario NDP. Side note, you normally get at least 3 asking you for fundraising or whatnot a day. But we had nothing. Not provincial delegates had no idea what was coming. We had no idea how we would choose a new leader. Nothing. So post-election, it's just a communication blackout. And when we tried to press the president of the ONDP, their response was, it's up to staff. We do not get a meeting until staff sets a date. We don't get any kind of movement until staff are ready. And, they hid behind staff needing to rest and whatnot. We know how they treat their employees there. That's not the issue. So they may not be powerful in the Canadian political spectrum, but in terms of all these people that we know that are trying to instill socialism in the party, who are trying to advocate for disability rights in the party, who are fighting anti-Black racism in society and within the party, and they're blocked, right? They're blocked by these staffers. And those same staffers delayed the convention. And I keep coming back to that, and people might roll their eyes, but that was essentially one of the downfalls of our losing to Ford, was that we were forced to take Andrea into the next election because they pushed the date back so far that there was no way we were going to change horses in the middle of the stream. They had already dedicated advertising revenue to Andrea's ads. They had been recorded, for heaven's sake. And so, that had a huge political cost. That's power that they have, right? So if they have that power within the party, maybe not outside the party, but it does play into it, what's the point of the executive, the democratically kind of elected executive? What's the point of it then?
So the executive is made up of members. Council is made up of members. The equity committees, members. The riding associations, members. And staffers. No, well, they are in those spaces members. Staff is only supposed to be there to support. So if we have a nomination meeting, they support. If it's an annual general meeting, they support. Convention, support. Council and executive, support. Those are member spaces. Those are not staff spaces. So the point of the executive and I can't let it go. You had talked about members view the staff as being the powerful people, but that only exists because members allow it to. These are our employees. So when we talk about, well, staff dictates this, when did we ever, as a membership through council, approve of that? Why don't we have access to the explicit duties, rights, and powers of the provincial director? And if they can do whatever they want, why in the proposed rules for the leadership race do they have to seek council's permission to add the rule of they get the ultimate say of who can and cannot run? So it does take a lot of complacency from members. And the executive, for them to say, oh, well, the staff have to do this, this, and this. Well, yeah, they have to because that is their job. By the way, you are the boss who dictates to them. So it's the point of the executive is truly to remind staff that the members are in charge and to look out for to make sure that it's a democratic, open, transparent process for the members who do the work to get staff paychecks. So the executive is the council outside of convention. Convention's the largest gathering of members. It's the most powerful body in the political structure of the party. Council exists between conventions as the ultimate power. The executive cannot do things without permission of the council. Council is the largest democratic body. It is the most powerful. So all of these power structures that exist are somehow beholden to the people who are employed by these bodies.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense.
There's like a purpose to the executive, and then there's what it is in reality. And I think you make a great point that this imbalance of power only exists through the complacency. That's the word that you use, and I think it's bang on, of the members. I don't want to blame members because I think a lot of it has to do with not understanding how the party works. And we've seen a lot of people like Tara and myself go in, get burnt out, and be tossed aside. And so it's hard, right? It's hard to be persistent in these spaces. It's hard to exercise your power when you don't fully understand it. So I hope some of these episodes start to allow folks to understand how partisan politics work on the left, how people are trying to insert themselves to make change, how they're being thwarted, and hopefully through these trial and errors, and we can follow up with what we can do from here, right? So although this episode had very few bright spots in terms of disrupting, as we try to do, the status quo within the party, it's good to know that there's people like you and Akuah, and we know that there are other good members that are on there within the party structures fighting for change. Down the road, we'll go coast to coast. We'll talk to people from BC and from the Atlantic and in between on just to demonstrate like how this is a pattern that is replicated and how other people are fighting back within this system so that they can reclaim these member spaces and then thus the electoral left, right? So that our only avenue within the House of Commons or the Ontario legislature for change right now is with a tightly controlled political group. And clearly that has to change, or in my opinion, the entire electoral system will be lost as an avenue for the left. So I know you've got like a million things that you could possibly say, but we've kind of come to the end of our time. So I thank you, Jay, for always persisting in these tough spaces, for helping walk members through, because you do this continually. I know you do one-on-one. You're consistently in New Demo Chat, coming up with ideas, trying to help people understand just why it's not so easy to just get elected onto the executive and make things happen. And, we do appreciate it. And I know it has, it does cost emotional labor, like Akuah mentioned, and you have kind of talked about here. But, we are appreciative that folks are in there doing the battle, because not all of us can all the time, right?
Can I leave on a final note?
Please.
So to fully encapsulate the mental health impact, the thing that has caused the largest mental health impact isn't actually the situations and the people who are causing these situations. It is being left out or left alone, dismissed when calling for support from others. So you talk of these people who are in these spaces fighting for democracy, fighting for transparency, fighting these issues. And when we say we need help, it doesn't matter what my title is. I'm one person. If there's 100 people, 1,000 people, it's the message, it's the meaning, it's the purpose that has the highest impact. So get in touch with the people who are speaking out, who are accessible on executives, and support them and support yourself, because it's our party.
Thank you for your perspective as always, Jay.
Thank you for having me.
Like in all things that we do, there is a team behind Blueprints of Disruption. I want to give a big thank you to our producers, Santiago Hello Quintero and Jay Woodruff. Our show is also made possible by the support of our listeners. So if you appreciate our content and would like to become a Patreon, please visit us at www.patreon.com/BP of Disruption. So if you know of any work that should be amplified or want to provide feedback of our show, please reach out to us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. Blueprints of Disruption is a project of New Left Media, an independent employee-owned company.